Karen, thanks so much for joining us at Hub Dialogues. I've really been looking forward to our conversation. Let's just start with some basics. For listeners who may not be familiar with what the First Nations LNG Alliance is, why don't you talk a bit about the work that you do, why it was created, what gaps you and others are trying to fill?
We recently changed our name on April 1st of this year to the First Nations Natural Gas Alliance. We were the First Nations LNG Alliance for the last 10 years. We started this organization when I was the chief of my nation. And back then, it was a highly, and could still be a highly controversial subject for the Wet'suwet'en people. And one of the main reasons why we started this organization was to create a space where we could educate people on what LNG is and what it isn't, and give them information and education on what it is so that they could make their own informed decision as whether they support LNG or not. So we started this organization. There was already an existing organization, the BC LNG Alliance, which was
Yes.
made up of industry, and there was no seat at the table for Indigenous people. So we just started our own organization because of the Coastal GasLink pipeline that was running throughout our territories. So we thought it would be a good place for our people or anyone who wanted to learn more about LNG and why some of the nations had signed on to this agreement and what it meant for our nation. So it was a huge deal, and we thought it would be timely to start an organization that would be meaningful to us.
Yes, indeed. Now, we talked a bit about what the organization is and does. I want to talk about your own personal experience. Of course, as you mentioned, you were chief during this pivotal and at times polarizing moment in Canadian life. Why don't you reflect on what it was like to lead during the rail blockades and what ultimately guided your decision to support the Coastal GasLink project in spite of the opposition?
Well, one of the things that I talk about when I do panel presentations is about when you become the chief, when you get elected in to be the chief of your nation,
Yes.
you have some choices in front of you. One is to we either just maintain the status quo, we just keep whatever meager funds we get from Indigenous Service Canada, or we find ways and means to get our own source revenue. And because this was an opportunity, this was the second line that our nation signed on to.
Hmm.
Prior to my being elected, the previous council signed on to the Pacific Trails pipeline, which there was absolutely no controversy. There was nothing in the media about it. And
Hmm.
so this was the second pipeline that our nation had signed on to. And there are six Wet'suwet'en nations, and I know that five of us were given the same opportunity, same agreement to sign our project agreement with Coastal GasLink. And we did it with very much we ensured that we explored all options, explored all avenues for our economy and for our environment, and
Hmm.
making sure that it was, responsible and sustainable for our environment, that it wasn't going to cause any major catastrophes for our people on the land. Um, we did a lot of our due diligence to ensure that this project was going to be uh, safe for our environment and also for our economy. So we weighed all issues and that were put before us. We had monthly community member meetings to ensure that our people were aware of what we were doing,
Hmm.
um, and we did our best to ensure that we included our membership, because that's who ultimately this agreement was for. So
Yes.
it was trying times. Um, our community in particular, because we were vocal in terms of why we signed, we in turn received the hugest backlash from social media and from pretty well the country, because the way it was pitted was hereditary chiefs versus elected councils. And
Yes.
in my view, I wasn't there to be at odds with our hereditary chiefs at all. In fact, my late mother was uh, a chief. She led our community. So I was, born and raised into that system. And so, had a lot of respect for it. And, we participated in our feast hall and our potlatch system. So I know full well and have a lot of respect for our hereditary system. But it just seemed that media had spun it in a way where we were at odds with them, and that was not my intent. That was not my perspective in order to get this agreement done. But that's how it was pitched, and I just stood my ground because at the end of the day, once the pipe is in the ground, our nation would start to see the benefits flow back to our community, which is happening now. And, a majority of First Nations communities have a lot of social issues in our community. We have
Sure.
language and culture issues where a lot of us don't speak our language. We have education and training issues where not a lot of our people are going into post-secondary programs. So, we have all these issues in front of us. And so a part of these funds that our nation is receiving is to address the housing issues, which we have more housing in our community now. We had water issues. Now we have uh, clean drinking water in our community. So a lot of things that mainstream society takes for granted, you know,
Yes.
those are things that we aspire to. So we have, our own source revenue. For example, we created the four pillar system, which was education and training, language and culture, and health and wellness. So if our people wanted to address their trauma, they'd be able to get some trauma counseling. If we wanted to learn our language, we could apply to different programs to learn our language. So that own source revenue has not only helped our community. During the time when I was the chief, we built a health clinic and a hall. We built a brand new administration building that had like an education department, a Head Start department, and room for all of our admin staff. And then we also had an Economic Development Corporation building. So with the revenues that have come in from government and industry, we were able to pay off those buildings. So I believe that um, you know, these benefits that we're receiving from this agreement is helping our people.
Mm.
My background was in social work, so that's in my nature to want to help our people increase the quality of life for our people. And I believe that we're on that path. And, I'm not sure, I'm sure that the other nations that are starting to receive their benefits, I'm sure that they're seeing that it's increasing the quality of life for their people. And that's really what the responsibility of a good leader is to really find ways and means to take care of the people. And I feel like that we've accomplished that.
Um, just such a powerful answer, Karen, and such an expression, as you say, of political leadership. I'm sure it resonates as much with our audience as it does for me. As you've mentioned, although the project was the subject of some contention uh, at various stages, it's now complete and producing these benefits for your community members, which which I'll say you don't have to say is a outcome of the foresight and leadership that you and others exercised in those difficult moments. I want to stay on the subject of the types of partnerships that we're seeing between First Nations communities and resource projects proponents more generally, including increasing instances of Indigenous equity and leadership. What do these types of partnerships in your mind signify for First Nations in northern British Columbia and other parts of the country? And how are they reshaping traditional ideas of economic development and sovereignty?
Well, I can say it's time. I I look at the most recent agreement that has been signed by, I believe it's now 38 First Nations going from the northeast of British Columbia down to Chilliwack, down to the lower mainland, where they've just signed an equity ownership deal on an existing pipeline. For me, that is creating history. It
Yes.
is opening the door for other industry companies to say, look, we've benefited from this existing line for 50, 60 years. It's time we include the Indigenous nations so that they can benefit, they can have their own source revenue and build their community. Because we have a lot of our communities that that aren't well established economically, that
Yes.
have poverty issues where our members are living below the poverty line. So First Nations want to address those issues, but they don't. People constantly tell us that we're living off taxpayer money. Well, we want to make our own money, and why not have all these existing infrastructure that's in the ground, include the Indigenous people on the equity ownership. I think that's a huge uh, way to tell Indigenous people, we hear you, we see you,
Yes.
we want to include you. We want to
Yes.
help you with your issues of poverty or your social issues, and this is the way we can do it.
Yes.
I think it's time that this is happening. I believe that it's opening the door for more industry to start opening that door for equity ownership for the nations. And I see that as a very positive move, not only for government, not only for industry, but for the Indigenous communities. And I'm seeing that that's the way to go because, all across Canada, you're going to be running into somebody's territory.
Yes.
We're on somebody's territory. So I think that it's only right that First Nations be included on every aspect. I used to say in presentations that we have highways, railways, transmission lines, pipelines that are going throughout our territories. And so this one that it's not going through our territory, but I'm seeing it as a green light. I'm seeing it as a positive move for industry so that First Nations can continue to fully participate economically. And I think that's a win-win-win across the board.
Here, here. Yeah, great, great answer. And what I've learned in preparation for our conversation is that those types of partnerships are not merely a consequence of the interplay between these projects and Indigenous territory. Indigenous communities are also contributing more broadly to the projects, including with respect to environmental stewardship, project design, and even governance itself. Can you point to some examples, Karen, where First Nations aren't just participating in these projects as through agreements or even through equity arrangements, but are even redefining what responsible development looks like?
I think from what I do know, I think when they say it's Indigenous led, it could mean a lot of different things to people, but I think when we look at the Indigenous perspective
Yes.
and the principles that come along with that, a lot of it is environmentally focused.
Mm,
A lot of what our people believe is that we were put here on this earth to take care of the land, to take care of our environment. So, because the land feeds us, it sustains us. And so we see ourselves as the stewards of the land. So when we see major projects coming about, some communities are well established. Like one example, when we were doing the Coastal GasLink piece, we had a group that brought our elders together, and we brought them out onto the land, into the territory, and showed them what the route where the pipeline was going to go. And, they were consulted and said, is this impacting anything in our environment, whether it was our berry patches or where we fished or anything that would impact us.
Mm.
And there was any ceremonial sites that we wanted to protect and preserve. We did those pieces. We called it a traditional land use and occupancy study.
Mm.
And that was derived from our elders, our knowledge holders in our community, and they were informed. And then once the report was done, we reported back to the community and said, this is what we've done. Um, and then we talked about the socioeconomic impacts that can happen, like a before and after snapshot. So we'd
Yes.
have demographics of how many people in our community are unemployed, how many people are living in poverty, how many people have post-secondary education or trades. So we did the demographics. And so we also wanted our people to be employed on these projects. And we
Yes.
and we would say we don't want our people having shovel jobs, which means housekeepers, cooks, and security. It's good if they want to do that, but we want meaningful jobs. So, for example, if our people wanted to get into a trade, we'd start now and get them built into the trade system and program so that they'd be, belong to one of the unions and be able to be employed on this project. We don't just want own source revenue from our project agreements. We want to fully participate in these projects through employment, through procurement, through equity ownership, all across the value stream is where we want to fully participate. And not just ownership on the project. We want to think outside the box. Like, for example, with this Coastal GasLink, what if we wanted to do some ownership on the shipping? We need to think broadly. We need to think
Mm.
outside the box on how we can leverage what we want to do and build our capacity. So I think it's a door that's wide open for First Nations that really want to build their communities economically while preserving their environment. That's really where we want to be. And I think that with what's being put in front of us, First Nations communities should be thriving.
Mm.
Should, I see so many opportunities for us, and I think we need to take them and run with them and make them happen for our community so that at the end of the day, we're lowering the issues of poverty. We want zero people on income assistance. We want, zero people living in poverty. We want zero social issues. So those are our goals as
Mm.
leadership moves forward. And I think that's positive.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Embedded in your answer, Karen, was observations about managing potential trade-offs between the economy and the environment and ensuring that those issues are adequately addressed. I want to ask you about another trade-off that seems to be playing out in the past several weeks. The Carney government clearly is committed to making progress on some of these issues. It wants to accelerate uh, policy decisions around particular projects in order to get them moving faster. Um, but there are also concerns about ensuring adequate and meaningful consultation with affected First Nations communities. Is that a trade-off in your mind that can be reconciled? Maybe put differently, do you think speed and meaningful consultation can occur simultaneously?
Speed and what?
And meaningful consultation.
Okay. Well, it feels like that's a double-edged sword. And I say that because, you know, as Indigenous people, we really have no good reason to trust government and industry just because we've been run roughshod over. Like that's what our history shows us. So, I fully understand that because of the threat of the tariffs from the US, that
Yes.
it's going to impact us economically as a country. But to want to fast track projects and not, and it appears and you can assume that the consultation is not going to take place where they say it will. My issues is that if you're going to be consulting with Indigenous people, then why not write it into the bill? You know, I say this on presentations that we didn't just get here. We've had to go through 600 plus court cases to get to
Yes.
our seat at the table. It wasn't willingly that the government and industry said, oh, yes, oh, let's include the First Nations. That wasn't the case. We had to fight for our seat at the table. And there's so many court cases that you can name that helped bring us here. And I thank those nations that had to spend the money to get us a seat at the table. So now government is saying, like, we're going to fast track projects that are in the national interest for the country. Well, without putting the consultation and accommodation piece into that bill, it doesn't give ease to the First Nations across Canada. Because it's not written into the legislation, they really don't have to consult with us. And that's a very huge concern.
Hmm.
It feels like we're going backwards.
Hmm.
And, we fully understand the situation that the country's in. We fully understand that, but don't rush these projects to the point where you feel like we're going to be missed, that we're going to miss the boat in terms of consultation, because that's really important. And I feel like, from my perspective, I feel like that there's going to be more court challenges.
Hmm.
And that's how we've gotten to where we're at. So I think
Hmm.
that's our only avenue to say to the government, look, we're here to stay. All we want is consultation and for the government to do their due diligence to get these projects to fruition. And uh, that's how I feel. And we're on this good path. But when you start seeing legislation where it's leaving us out, those become red flags for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
as fast as we want to get these projects done, do your due diligence is what I see as an Indigenous person.
Yeah, it's a good message for those policymakers who listen to our podcast, Karen. Um, Before we wrap up, I just want to ask you about some of your experience in doing international outreach. Not only have you been a leading voice in domestic conversations around energy development, you've also been present on the global energy stage. Let's start there. Why is that important to you?
Well, I've been invited to different countries to speak about Indigenous people in Canada, because a lot of different countries get the message that Canada is not open for business, with all of the emission caps and it didn't look like oil and gas were going anywhere.
Yes.
We were pushing more towards cleaner energy. But when you went around to different countries like Beijing, China, or Tokyo, Japan, different Asian countries would be saying, we want and we need your LNG.
Yes.
And we'd have countries say, we're on a 6-step energy plan for our country. We're on step 2. And we can't move beyond step 2 without Canadian LNG. So, we'd have these countries telling us, like China, for example, China is the highest emitting country in the world. Uh,
Yes.
I think it was like 35% of the world emissions, global emissions. And then we have the US at, I think was 12.5%, and India at 7.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And Canada was at a whopping 1.5%.
Yes.
But yet I feel like our energy plan was overkill. And I feel like we would be better off to sell our our natural gas to these countries that need it to lower their emissions, to get China off of coal and lower the greenhouse gas emissions, because emissions have no borders. If we truly say
Yes.
care about the environment, then we're going to look at things globally and
Yes.
act locally. So, I see that as a win-win-win if we can, look at our greenhouse gas emissions globally and find a solution forward. And I always say that, and I'd come back with a message at different conferences and saying, you know what, I've just come back from Beijing or Tokyo, or we got messages from Vietnam saying we need your LNG and we need to get off of coal. Those were the strong messages that we continued to deliver when we came home, and it felt like it was falling on deaf ears. But yeah,
Yeah, well, that's a there's a ton of insight there. You mentioned Tokyo. Let me ask about that specifically, Karen, because you recently traveled there as part of a delegation with Energy for a Secure Future. What was that experience like? What did you hear from Japanese leaders about their interest in Canadian LNG? And as importantly, what message did you bring forward about Indigenous leadership in energy and the importance of responsible resource development?
well, it was a similar message that we've heard from Beijing, China, or Vietnam. They they really want our LNG. They have other countries that they're receiving LNG from, but they at the time we went, there was no deliveries from Canada, which
Yes.
now that we speak, LNG Canada is shipping to Japan now. So uh, we continuously heard the same message from Japan that we want your LNG, and again, it's going to help with their energy plan for their country. So, we've heard from, like, our delegations heard it loud and clear again from Japan that we want the LNG. And they gave us a lot of good reasons on why they want it, and it's similar to the rest of the world.
Yes.
We want to help with the global greenhouse gas emissions, and this is one of the ways we can do it. And so when our delegation with Energy for a Secure Future went, that's what we've heard. And we brought that same message home from Japan to Canada. And we continuously give that message to people that don't know that other countries need our resources.
Let's wrap up by, in a way, ending where we started, and that is the tremendous progress that we're seeing between Indigenous communities and resource companies to unlock the benefits for affected communities and to bring the expertise um, and perspective of Indigenous communities to make these projects successful. What do you think, or what do you hope rather comes next from Canada, both governments and industry, to support more Indigenous-led development and create the benefits that your community now is garnering from the leadership that you exercised years ago?
What I see is one issue is that we have this loan guarantee program that
Yes.
Mark Carney had got into being our prime minister. He had raised it from 5 billion to 10 billion
Yes.
for Canada, the whole of Canada. And then we have the provinces at different levels. I think BC might have been at 1 billion. Alberta was at 3 billion. And I don't know about the other provinces, but I just feel like if they're truly sincere about helping Indigenous nations get equity ownership on major projects, then they should be matching each other.
Hmm.
If they want communities to succeed, then make that much more attractive to First Nations to want to apply to these loan guarantees so that we can bid on major projects and own them. I
Hmm.
think that's one of the ways to go. The other piece I think is that's really critically important is writing it into the legislation C5 that consultation is and will happen with Indigenous people, accommodation will also happen. I don't think that that can be rushed. You got to do your due diligence with the Indigenous people if you want to continue to maintain what levels of trust you have with government and industry. That is a must. If he says he's going to do it, and that's what he's telling First Nations, then write it into the bill. That will give comfort to the Indigenous people that, yes, government and industry are sincere about their relationship with us. They're sincere about doing their consultation piece and doing their due diligence with us. I think that's critically important. And I'm hoping that this podcast, the policymakers for government will hear this and hear the voices of the Indigenous people across Canada.
What a brilliant way to wrap up what's been a really insightful and powerful conversation. Karen Ogen from the First Nations Natural Gas Alliance, thank you so much for joining us at Hub Dialogues.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.